Welcome back to another lecture of Psychology 101. This is your instructor, Dr. Shadi Bashai, and in today's lecture, we will discuss social psychology and social influences over human behavior. And this is part 1 of this particular unit, and this unit corresponds to chapter 13 of your textbook, and here we go. I challenge you to stop this video and take a few minutes to watch the embedded YouTube clip. This is the story of Kitty Genovese, the young woman who in 1964, on a cold March night in New York City, was murdered. What was amazing about the murder of Kitty Genovese is that 13 witnesses watched and listened from their windows as she was mugged and brutally murdered. Yet none of the witnesses came to her rescue or even called the police. Are the witnesses in the Kitty Genovese murder evil? Are they psychopathic? The answer is no. Research is now showing us that social factors can influence people's behaviors in powerful ways. The story of Kitty Genovese can be explained through something called the bystander non-intervention effect, a rule of thumb discovered by social psychologists, which says that the mere presence of other witnesses during an emergency situation puts forces in motion that prevents each of these witnesses from actually taking action on coming to that person's rescue. So what is social psychology? It is the study of how people influence each other's behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes. When we look out into the world, we see people in their individual behavior, and for that reason, we underestimate the power of the social situation. Social factors are powerful in determining people's behavior, and this influence applies to all equally, so no one is exempt from these social influences. So how and why are social factors so influential over our behavior? Because we are inherently social beings. We excel when we band together, and so we have evolved to be highly social and to solve social problems. Many psychologists have attempted to actually quantify or put a number on how social we are as well as the extent of our social needs. And a famous researcher by the name of Dunbar proposed that people need to maintain a social circle of about 150 people or so for what he believed to be optimal social fulfillment. Dunbar believed that too much beyond that number of 150 in people's social circle, and the nature of the relationships becomes a bit too shallow, and too little, so less than that number of 150, and the social needs will become unmet, if you will. So that's the magic number, about 150 in people's social circles. Other psychologists, such as someone by the name of Leary, have proposed that the need to belong is so central to humanity that it drives much of our behavior. Our need to belong is so powerful that social isolation can be used as a powerful punishment, and social inclusion, on the other hand, a powerful incentive to our behavior. So, as mentioned, our drive to be social has evolved over time since being social, working with others, building communities, that's become advantageous to our survival as a human race. So natural selection selected for these social traits because they gave us an advantage to survive and reproduce. Some of these advantages of banding together, of being social, include fighting off predators, pooling resources together to secure food and shelter, for example, finding mates, which is obviously necessary in a social circumstance or social situation. Even though our social drive, for the most part, has been positive, social influences can and do sometimes have a very negative impact on our behavior, especially if we're unaware or we're blind to these social influences. And hopefully, throughout this unit, we'll gain a better appreciation of what these social forces look like in our everyday life. So, not only is being social important for survival, but it's important in helping us actually evaluate where we stand in comparison to everybody else. That is, Festinger's social comparison theory says that we evaluate our abilities, attitudes, and beliefs by comparing ourselves, actually, or comparing our attitudes and beliefs and abilities to those of other people. So other people, their beliefs, their performance, almost becomes like a benchmark by which we evaluate ourselves. When we compare ourselves with other people, we can do it in one of two ways. First, people use something called upward comparisons. And this is when you compare yourself with someone you believe is superior to you in some way or the other. So this could be positive, actually. So if you're comparing yourself to someone who you believe is superior to you on a particular trait of interest, this could be positive, especially if you use that person as motivation to change, or you see that person as kind of a role model, if you will. If they can do it, so can I, kind of mentality. And the second way by which we compare ourselves is called downward comparison, which is when you compare yourself to someone who you perceive or you deem as inferior to you on some important variable of interest. So this too can actually work to boost self-esteem and confidence, because of course when engaging in downward comparison or comparing yourself to somebody who you think is less than you in some important respect, we feel good, obviously, for perceiving ourselves to be better than that comparison point. Even though both types of comparisons, upward and downward, can be good, most research on the topic points to the pernicious nature of these comparisons, especially a form of comparison that's typified by things like envy, resentment, or anger, feeling like the other person doesn't deserve where they're at or doesn't deserve their success. And most research actually shows us that these types of negative comparisons, so the ones that are laden with negative emotionality, envy, resentment, these types of negative comparisons, is what the research is telling us, are actually associated with heightened depression and anxiety symptoms. So it's depending on what kind of comparison we engage in, it could mean exacerbation of mental health related symptoms. I want you to imagine this scenario with me here. Imagine you're on an airplane and in the middle of your journey, and you're in the full elevation of this. The plane begins to experience relatively violent turbulence. So you fasten your seatbelt, you grip the handle of your seat, try and bear the brunt of that violent turbulence. And you look around you and you witness the passengers around you acting incredibly calmly. And you see two flight crew members. They're conversing nonchalantly near the cabin. So once you've imagined that scenario, I want you to imagine the opposite scene, if you will. So you go through violent turbulence, and then you look around, and what you see is a scene of panic, if you will. People are panicking, flight attendants rushing to their seats with a look of panic and worry in their eyes. So these two scenarios show us that we often look to other people to know where we stand and to know how to act in a particular situation too, to know whether to be calm or to panic, for example. But sometimes these social influences can actually lead us astray, as you can probably imagine. Mass hysteria is when there is an outbreak of contagious, irrational belief or belief for which there's no evidence. Or when more than one person simultaneously experiences symptoms of excitement or fear, for example. Okay, and that has they have no reason for experiencing these things that is factual or evidentiary. We witnessed a form of mass hysteria with a dystopian novel called War of the Worlds. And that novel was actually read in a radio broadcast in 1938. And the people putting on that broadcast made sure to make listeners believe that the recording, the broadcast, was actually as if it's almost like a real events that are occurring. It's almost like a news broadcast. So listeners actually believed that their cities were being invaded by aliens, which is the story of the book here. So a type of mass hysteria called mass delusion is when more than one person share in a bizarre belief, such as the belief, for example, that a large group of people saw a flying saucer, so that belief held amongst that group of people that they saw a flying saucer is what is called mass delusion, which is a form of mass hysteria. Urban legends are also a form of mass hysteria. And that's when there is a broken telephone effect of information as it flows from one generation to another, or flows socially, if you will, vertically in time. Horizontally in time, I should say. There is an urban legend about Walt Disney, for example, and how he had his body cryogenically frozen. Of course, there's no evidence of this urban legend. And then there's an urban legend about a metal artist that was active in the 90s, Marilyn Manson. He was active in the 90s and early 2000s. And I'm not going to tell you what that urban legend around Marilyn Manson is. I will let you discover that urban legend out for yourself. You only have to examine your thought content to know that we're very social creatures. Much of our thoughts are actually concerned about other people. So social cognitions are any thoughts that are dedicated to analyzing, interpreting other people's behavior and how we fit in with other people. Attributions are a form of social cognition, and attributions is the process by which a person assigns a cause to people's behavior. So if we'll use this as a running example in the next few slides, if someone cuts you off in traffic, for example, calling them an a-hole is you attributing their crappy behavior as being driven by something internal, something related to who they are. I was going to say the actual word, their a-holeness. So when you say they cut you off because they're an a-hole, you're saying that their a-holeness is what's responsible for causing them to cut you off. So that's you've made an attribution that's internal in nature. So why do we think about other people in the way we do? And why do we spend a lot of time trying to understand why people do the things that they do? That is, why do we attribute causes to behaviors? Well, it's because it helps us understand, it helps us predict, and it helps us control our environment, especially our social environment. It also helps us figure out how we feel and think about other people and ourselves. For example, and again, we'll use that same example I gave in a previous slide. If you assume that the person cutting you off in traffic has done so for some internal reason, let's say because of their a-holeness, then this attribution that they cut you off because they're an a-hole, this attribution will probably also make you wary of interactions with that particular person if you ever got the opportunity or the chance to interact with them. and perhaps will lead you to distrust that person and maybe not engage with that person very much. So attributions help us determine how to act around others and helps us understand where we and our performance stands against the rest of the people, and where our causes and other people's causes are maybe aligned, if you will, or the causes of their behavior, sorry. So take a few minutes to ponder the following. Joe, a 20-year-old person, robbed a bank. Without knowing anything else about the situation, why do you think he did it? So some of you will engage in something called the fundamental attribution error in trying to understand why Joe robbed the bank. So the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overestimate the impact of internal or dispositional or personality forces on people's behavior. For example, we talked about that person that cut you off in traffic earlier, right? If you remember that. Maybe some of you thought they cut you off because they're an a-hole, as we've given the example multiple times. So this interpretation of their behavior is more in line with the fundamental attribution error, which tells us that we're paying too much attention to the internal reasons why someone might have done something like that. And if you're paying too much attention to their a-holeness, which is, of course, an internal dispositional drive, you also are likely, if you're engaging in a fundamental attribution error, you're also likely forgetting about or underestimating the impact and the power of the situation in determining that person's behavior. Maybe they were late. Maybe they have a pregnant wife who is about to give birth in the back seat, and that's why they're cut you off in traffic. You know, it's not only the fact that they're an a-hole. Maybe there's other things that are happening in their life. So this is to say, we focus too much on internal reasons why people do the things that they do. So they're smart, you know, they're dedicated, they're extroverted, you know, if they go to parties, we come up with these explanations. And we often forget that there are situational factors that may drive that person's behavior. That is the fundamental attribution error. It turns out that we're guilty of the fundamental attribution error more often when we're trying to understand other people's behavior. But we hardly make the same mistake, that is, put too much weight on disposition or personality, when we're trying to understand or evaluate our own behavior. When we do that, we usually when we do try to understand our own behavior, we usually give a lot more weight to external or situational factors in determining our own personal behavior. So it applies to other people more often than it applies to self. So people engage more in fundamental attribution error, or giving too much weight to internal factors or internal drives when they're evaluating other people's behavior. So it turns out the tendency to engage in the fundamental attribution error really depends on which culture you find yourself in. As you can probably imagine, in a culture that emphasizes the needs of the group or the collective over the needs of the individual, so these cultures are called collectivist cultures, people are less likely to engage in the fundamental attribution error when they're judging other people's behavior. So the fundamental attribution error is more likely if you live or were raised in an individualistic culture, which is a type of culture such as most Western cultures, for example. And these types of cultures, individualistic cultures, really value the needs and the goals of the individual over the needs and the goals of the collective or the group. So this effect has been shown through a series of studies. So this effect that the fundamental attribution error is more likely in an individualistic culture has been shown through a series of studies where the researchers asked students from collectivist and individualist cultures to read a news article about someone who was guilty of some kind of a criminal behavior. And then participants were asked to explain why they think that person engaged in that criminal behavior. Turns out individuals from collectivist cultures were more likely to give explanations which were external. They were raised in a bad home, they were facing financial pressures, etc. Whereas people from individualistic cultures were more likely to cite dispositional factors, again, engaging in that fundamental attribution error. So people in individualistic cultures were more likely to say things like, that person did it, so that person engaged in that criminal behavior because they're evil, because they're selfish. Reality is, we often miss how powerful social situations are in determining our and other people's behavior. I want you to imagine the following scenario with me here. Imagine you are a research participant in a study and you show up to take part in the study, and you are directed to a room where 4 or 5 other participants are also waiting. Then a researcher shows up, and the researcher begins and tells you the point of the study is to get your opinion about a perceptual problem. He shows you and the rest of the participants, you and the 4 others waiting, a line on the left-hand side and 3 lines on the right-hand side. I'll show you what that might look like. And basically, your job is to say out loud in the group which one of the 3 lines here, corresponds to the length of the line on the left-hand side here. Okay? So just matching the length of the line on the right and on the left. And of course, if you're looking at this, much like I'm looking at it, the answer becomes incredibly clear. There is one line on the right that very clearly resembles the target line on the left. And I would say that that's C, right? Very clearly. However, and to your amazement, the other people who start, the other participants start saying their answers out loud, and to your amazement, they start providing answers out loud to the researchers, and they all agree on the answer, but the answer that they're giving is blatantly and obviously just wrong. So let's say that same example again. Let's say everyone in the group is giving the answer A instead of the obvious answer C. And this happens one after one after one. So, do you mistrust your own eyes and go with the answer of other people? And that was pretty much the setup in a set of very famous studies by a researcher by the name of Solomon Asch. And Solomon Asch was really interested in understanding the power of the situation, the power of social factors. So in particular, his set of studies were concerned with whether people conform to peer pressure. In reality, the other participants in the study were all in on it. So they were what psychologists call research confederates. So they were all in on the experiment and were instructed by the researcher to give the wrong answers on purpose. So the point of the study really was to see if you, as a participant, would go along with whatever the rest of the crowd are saying. So I want you I challenge you to stop the video right now and watch the supplementary YouTube clip here that will, again, supplement some of these ideas that I'm talking about here. So Solomon Asch's experiments on conformity, they teach us a number of things about the power of the situation. For example, we learned from his studies that when all the confederates, so all the quote-unquote participants who were in on it, so when all of them were unanimous in the wrong answer, it made the actual participants in the study more likely to conform or more likely to just go along with what the crowd is saying. So that's the unanimity concept here. So even if they give the wrong answer, but they're all in agreement about the wrong answer, that made it more likely for participants to go along with what people are saying, so go along with the wrong choice. We also learned another thing. Even if there is some disagreement among the Confederates, even if the disagreement is still wrong, that is, I'll show you that example again. Let's say 2 out of the 4 picked A as the right answer. So 2 out of the 4 Confederates picked A, and the remaining 2 out of 4 Confederates picked C. So when there is disagreement about the wrong answer even, that actually made it less likely for participants to conform or go along with the wrong answer. And then finally, we learned that the size of the group matters, but up to a point, really. We find that conformity reached a peak, if you will, when there were about 4 or 5 people in the group. So adding more people who gave wrong answers to this number didn't really seem to increase the level of conformity. So that is, conformity kind of plateaued at around 4 or 5 people giving their answers. So this set of ingenious conformity studies by Solomon Asch has been replicated a number of times, actually. So the results have been duplicated. Remember, it's one of the principles of science. Replication is. So with the power of current imaging technology, recent studies, including one by a researcher by the name of Burns and others in 2005, so they can actually pinpoint where in the brain that people feel this need to conform to the crowd. And what Burns and others actually learned was that conformity is associated with activation of a brain region called the amygdala, which is the brain's center of emotion, if you will, and especially including emotions that relate to anxiety or threat. So the conclusion of the researchers is that we sometimes feel anxious about the possibility of disagreeing with the crowd, and so to avoid this anxiety of being ostracized or singled out, we just go along with whatever the group is saying. And I'm sure, we've all we've all encountered the influence of conformity. And I'm sure you can think of examples like that in your life where you felt this social pressure, if you will, to go along with others, and the anxiety associated with maybe dissenting or saying no or disagreeing in a group of fairly cohesive people. So research is teaching us that levels of conformity really also depend on whether or not you were raised in a collectivist or an individualist culture. As you can probably imagine, people in collectivist cultures, so cultures that value the needs and the goals of the collective over the individual, or the group over the individual, so people raised in these cultures are more likely to conform than people who are raised and or they have an individualistic culture orientation. So this is when the needs of the individual are emphasized over the needs of the group. So research in this area also teaches us that people with lower self-esteem are more likely to conform compared with people who have higher self-esteem. Finally, there appear to be differences in conformity between men and women, but this is more pronounced when women are faced with pressures to conform from men, probably reflecting some societal biases there in the way we process genders and some stereotype threat here as well. Another powerful social force that determines our behavior, or can determine our behavior, is the sense of de-individuation, which is the tendency to behave in an atypical way when we feel like our identities are hidden, or when we think that we're acting anonymously. So it's this belief that we're anonymous, along with the belief that basically my identity is not revealed, that makes people feel less responsible for their behaviors. So this lack of identity, this feeling or sense of de-individuation, makes people not responsible for, or at least feel that they're not responsible for the consequences. And that really is part of the drive of de-individuated behavior. The power of de-individuation and its influence over behavior was demonstrated through a very, very well-known observational study conducted by a psychologist by the name of Philip Zimbardo. Imagine with me here, you sign up for the study, and a few days later, you're awakened by loud banging on your door, on your front door there, and someone saying that they're from the local police department here to escort you to quote-unquote prison. So you get your hands cuffed, and then you are brought into the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University, where you are kept and treated like a common criminal. You'll be asked to remove your personal clothing, for example, wear a number, people associate you with just a number, not a name at all. And then you're locked away in these very small, dingy cells. And this is basically the setup of Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. He recruited a group of healthy young adults university students, to participate in this particular study, and they were randomly assigned into two conditions. They were randomly assigned to be they're given either the role of prisoner, which is the scenario that I just kind of made you go through, or they were assigned to the role of a prison guard. The study was supposed to last 14 days, but it actually had to end after only 6 days. And the reason for that was the guards, who were pretty similar to the prisoners in all respect, and in fact they were randomly assigned to be either prisoner or guard, just basically based on whether or not they were prisoner or guard in this experiment was based on a coin flip and nothing more. So they were pretty much identical in every way. So the guards, the prison guards, they started behaving in very inhumane ways towards the prisoners, and the prisoners in turn began to retaliate. It was almost like the make-believe situation that Zimbardo created in the basement of the psychology department in Stanford. It's almost like the make-believe situation started to take on a life of its own, and people started buying into their arbitrary roles. Again, a stark reminder of the power of the situation. So the scary part almost is that the Stanford prison experiment was conducted in 1973. Very similar events occurred in a real-life situation, and that's in the Abu Ghraib scenario in Iraq. And this is when American soldiers started treating Iraqi prisoners in extremely dire through extremely dire conditions and through extremely dire behavior, and it was extremely inhumane, as many people have noted after that fact. So it's funny how these social situations, how powerful they are, but also the fact that they repeat themselves in history, if you will. So another powerful way through which our behavior is influenced by social factors is this concept of groupthink. And groupthink is defined as a socially driven mentality that is sometimes fostered by certain groups or organizations, and this mentality is often emphasizes group unanimity and cohesion over critical thinking. For this reason, groups that exhibit this groupthink mentality often engage in poor decision making. And this is basically because groupthink often punishes dissent or punishes people voicing ideas or opinions that are not in keeping with the group's mentality. Given the similarity in the group members' views, poor decisions are often made because no new or corrective information is ever considered. The remedy for groupthink, as you can probably imagine, is pretty simple. So groups and group leaders must actively encourage differing opinions and actively encourage dissent within their members. Here are a few symptoms of groupthink. So groups with this mentality of groupthink, so they often think that the group is invulnerable, so they often champion attitudes such as, we can't possibly fail. Groupthink may also give off this illusion that everyone in the group agrees about something. Groupthink may also have very high pressures to conform. Sometimes it's implicit, these implicit pressures that you need to conform to what everybody else is saying or how everybody else believes. Or sometimes they can be or emphasize unquestioning the beliefs of or the correctness or the moral superiority of the group over other groups, for example. So many different symptoms of what groupthink might look like. So we can also make poor decisions in group based on another concept, and that concept is called group polarization. So this concept is defined as if a group of people who are somewhat in agreement about a topic get together to discuss that set topic, their views on the topic after the group discussion tend to get polarized towards whatever end of the continuum they started out in. So this is to say, there are studies that show that if a group of students, for example, show an initial prejudice, so it might be a tiny little prejudice against a group of people, let's say a certain race or cultural group or sexual orientation. So if that group of students show us a slight prejudice to begin with, after meeting with like-minded individuals in the group, the views of the members in that group will actually become polarized and actually show greater bias and prejudice by the end of the group discussion. It could actually work the opposite way too. So if a group of people are slightly unprejudiced, for example, get together, they can often come out of the group discussion even less prejudiced than they started out with. So it can work both ways, this concept of group polarization. Groupthink and group polarization are very powerful social forces. And perhaps one of the most tragic demonstrations of groupthink is the sad events surrounding a cult by the name of Heaven's Gate, which operated from the 1970s to the 1990s. On a very fateful and sad March afternoon, investigators discovered the bodies of 39 members of the cult of Heaven's Gate. Marshall Applewhite, who was the cult's leader at the time, Marshall Applewhite convinced all 39 members that in order to reach the next spiritual phase of their journey, if you will, that they all must leave their bodies behind. And so these members, convinced of this fact, willingly consumed poisonous substances in the form of a spiked juice, spiked with poison, and they all unfortunately met their death. So groupthink can be a very dangerous thing. Until next time.